Thank you, Catherine, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to have been asked to talk to you today. And my topic is gender norms and stereotypes. I want to start off by talking about definitions, because we're using a lot of these words that sometimes aren't very clear. And even the definition of the difference between sex and gender is not always clear and is quite often debated. So when I give you my definition, somebody else might say, it doesn't suit me, but I'm going to go ahead anyway. Sex is determined by biological characteristics associated with being male or female. Very rarely, about 1 in 2,000, maybe 1 in 1,500 children are born with ambiguous genitalia, and there might be some difficulty in assigning them clearly to being boy or girl at birth. Transgender is a term that many of us have only become familiar with us recently. A transgender individual might wish to change from being seen as male and masculine to female and feminine. Transsexual would involve actual change of secondary sexual characteristics in order to acquire the appearance and function of the opposite sex. Gender, then, is a person's social and cultural identification as male or female, masculine or feminine. I've been asked to talk about norms and standards. They are the behaviors in this context that we expect from males and females, and they vary cross-culturally, and they vary historically, and we can see that just looking back in time in our own country. Sex role stereotypes, then, are beliefs held about male and female natures and capacities. Stereotypes are important, as we've already seen. They have impact in a number of different ways. So, for example, if we hold the stereotype, boys don't cry, we might be likely to say, as a parent, don't cry to the little boy. But the little boy himself, thinking, I am a boy, boys don't cry, might say, I'm a big boy, I mustn't cry. We see stereotypes operating in terms of discrimination and bias. So if we hold views that women are softer and more emotional, we might say, well, we can't hire a woman for that job, which involves a lot of tough decisions and leadership of maybe a bunch of men. We see stereotypes operating to restrict options. So we hold a stereotype maybe that girls love pink and cute animals, so we find in the shops nothing but pink clothes covered with butterflies and unicorns available for our little girls. It's interesting, and this is something you may be aware of, that 100 years ago, pink was thought to be a very strong color and suitable for boys, and blue was thought to be a very delicate color, which was obviously suitable for boys. So this just shows how arbitrary some of our stereotypes might be. Then we find more seriously stereotypes operating to infringe people's human rights. So if we happen to have a view that women's role is to serve men, that may be lead to a situation such as we find with basically domestic slavery and similar infringements of people's human rights, both male and female. So where do these differences that we see between men and women as we look around, where do they come from? Well, certainly they come from our biology. Sometimes, say, a feminist perspective is seen to deny biology. I don't think we can deny biology. When we look at newborn babies, we see differences in size, in activity levels, and in vulnerability, boys being much more vulnerable than girls to a lot of different conditions. This is why there are more boys born than girls, to adjust for that physical vulnerability of baby boys in gestation and around the time of birth. But these differences are actually quite small, and they are evident at a group level. So if we simply know what sex a baby is or a small child is, it's quite uninformative about their size or their strength, the overlap being as large as it is. As they get older, we will see the emergence of other differences that probably have biological roots. Girls, for example, all over the world are found to develop language skills earlier. Boys have greater muscular strength, and as they enter puberty, some of these differences become more marked, and some of the differences are, of course, that we see at that time are biological. And then we have socialization. We seem to take quite small biological differences and we build on them. The overlap, as I say, remains considerable in childhood and later. And for example, you will get girls who are stronger than boys and boys who are more verbally competent than girls. These biological differences are universal, but what societies make of them will vary across cultures and across times. What we do know is that lack of opportunity can create some biological differences. For example, in this picture, we see a little girl kind of throwing like a girl, that expression. On the other side, we see an Olympic shot putter, I think it's a shot, but I'm not very good on these things, who obviously is very capable biologically at this point. And giving opportunity to boys or girls to do things can actually change their brains and their muscularity and their bodily capacity. So socialization and expectations can change biology. And here's where stereotypes come in. At this point, I want to show you a little video, which I think is quite informative.
Look at this. Look at this. Do you like a dolly? Should we go for the dolly? There's a good girl. You're a good little girl, aren't you, Sophie? Look, what does this say? Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams. Ooh, look at this, Sophie. Meow, meow. I think she liked that pink dolly the best.
If I were to tell you actually that Sophie is Edward,
does
that change anything?
I maybe thought, oh, this is a little girl, so I have to give her little girl things.
Say hello. Say hello. 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 Come on.
What's this one? What's that one do? Is that a robot? What about this? You like that one? What does this one do? Oliver. Oliver.
You've gone for, you could say, boy toys for this boy.
Possibly in my subconscious, but for me, I was just going for what was around me, but then perhaps my subconscious was automatically playing a trick on me that I was...
If I tell you that he is actually a girl.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. I suppose it's because of the stereotype.
And then that changed your behaviour towards the child.
It did.
And your behaviour was quite directive.
1, 2, 3. Beep, 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 beep. Do you want to see my robot?
She's picked up the robot, the car, the puzzle game, and I think she's been much more physical in handling the child than the other adults have been with girls.
That really astounded me because I thought that I was somebody that had a really open mind.
Surprise. So I automatically went for the pink fluffy toy because I said it was a girl, so I was sort of stereotyping
I've always thought I was rather more open-minded than that, and I would think, you know, these are children's toys, whatever the gender.
It will make me think the next time I'm with a child, so my niece or my nephew, to make sure that I am actually being sort of fair and equal with all of them, and just giving each child an opportunity to just be whoever they are.
So, as you see, I think quite strongly in that study, which, as I say, has been often replicated. I actually replicated it several times with my students here in Dublin. Stereotypes can often operate unconsciously. Typically, if you ask parents if they would treat their boys and girls any differently, they often say, oh, no. But in actuality, they find themselves doing so. Some very famous researchers in this area, Maccabee and Jacqueline, who looked at a whole range of stereotypes about boys and girls' behavior, including things like girls talk more, etc., and found most of them not to be substantiated. They said that most gender role stereotypes are cultural myths. But they persist, and that's the interesting question. Why do they persist? In fact, we use stereotypes all the time, not just in relation to gender. It's one of the ways we organize the world around us. They simplify our complex world. And they may also serve agendas, say the agendas of those who have power and don't want to relinquish it, or those who feel threatened in some way by another group, or those who want to bolster their own feelings. So we get pernicious stereotypes like white people are more intelligent, things that we find very shocking, but that we need to look at why do people think this way? Why does this way of thinking persist? Why are stereotypes perpetuated? Do they serve some functions? I want to look at gender norms and stereotyping in the family. Families don't exist in isolation. Everybody in the family is being influenced by their external context and by their own histories. So as parents, if we are parents, we bring our history to bear. But the family does matter a lot. It has an early and very direct impact on the child's behavior and beliefs. It's very important, and it starts very early. And in fact, these days, it starts earlier than ever, because these days, many parents will choose to find out the sex of their children, and they can do so by ultrasound at about 20 weeks. They can do so even earlier if they want, through using DNA pregnancy tests, which give them that information. And now we have the new phenomenon, which seems to have entered Ireland from the USA, of gender reveal parties, where very, very early on in pregnancy, everybody is celebrating the fact that this baby to come is either a boy or a girl. This balloon, when popped, will have blue confetti or pink confetti already for the party. Parents may participate in sex role stereotyping either consciously or unconsciously. For some parents, it's important that their boys behave like boys and their girls behave like girls, but others, as I said, that maybe an unconscious process is going on that they'd be quite shocked by or are shocked by if they are revealed. You find it in the choice of decor, the boys' bedroom versus the girls' bedroom, and clothing and toys, those choices that parents make. And then in the behaviors directed towards the child, whether they are reinforced or discouraged from certain patterns of behavior versus others. We find that parents encourage play with same-sex toys, and they sit closer to girls and talk more with them. There's quite a lot of evidence in different research studies of parents behaving differently, even though they think they don't. And we do find a relationship between high levels of stereotyped thinking in parents and more stereotyped behavior in their children. And as I've said, the outside will get inside into the family, so the books the kids read, the TV that they watch, all of these things will have an influence from early days. And children, of course, will adopt these stereotypes themselves. They're not passive in this process. They actively get involved in stereotyping the others and in typing themselves at this idea, I am a girl, therefore I do girl things. And little kids are very strong on those sorts of rules. By age 2, children typically become aware of being a boy or a girl and can label themselves. And by 3, they've started to develop stereotyped ideas about boys and girls. So even in preschool, you'll find them saying, I'm not wearing that pink shirt, or I'm not going to play with dolls. And the girls sort of will comment on each other's behavior, whether it's appropriate, or boys don't wear bobbles in their hair. All of this happens in preschool and has been widely observed. Gender role conformity becomes very strong from about the age of 3 to 9, and I know you've heard from the young scientists earlier, and that was very marked in their study, which was on, I think, around the kids around the age 7 to 9. It is actually more marked in boys. So tomboy, as we've heard already, is a more acceptable thing to be called as a girl than the opposite for boys, and which has a less positive connotation. So boys are called often sissy, and we have discovered in studies done here in Ireland that they use the term gay as a term of abuse, really, against little boys who they think are unduly feminine. So this is a very unfortunate pattern of behavior that we see from very early on. And this self-policing and policing by peers starts in the preschool years. We don't have to wait until later to see evidence of this. What does happen a little bit later on, around about 8, 9, is that children get a bit more flexible about these rules. And so we have a period of a few years where they're much more tolerant of infringement of the rules. But this tends to become intensified again when they get to teenage years and puberty kicks in, and it matters very much as to you being seen as a feminine or masculine in your behavior. In growing up in Ireland, which I was involved in for a number of years, we asked 9-year-olds about the opposite sex. And we found these are some of the comments the kids made. So 9-year-old boys, the girls dress different and play different and they think different. And another one, girls like to do makeup and their nails and they're like puppies and everything cute and they like pink things. And the interviewer says, and what about boys? Boys like the outdoors more. They like to stand in a field. I have this lovely little sort of image of it. I think clearly a boy from the country. Girls say, oh, boys are much more immature than girls, I think. They just, when you try to be serious with them, they just go and mess with their friends or something. Another girl, boys are really different. They play different sports, wear different clothes, do different stuff. They spend way too much time watching TV and on the computer, and they don't read books unless they are nerds. So there you go. So how might one counteract these stereotypes? There's multiple possibilities for doing so. Once one agrees that this is something that is important to do. So through legislation and regulation, we might have it in terms of the introduction of referenda, perhaps, in terms of trade bodies like the Irish Advertising Standards Authority for Ireland. They talk about ads should avoid stereotyping. Sex discrimination is one of the 9 grounds for discrimination, which can be used in terms of employment disputes, etc. We might introduce positive discrimination and quotas. These are all policy and legislative choices that are open to us. In education, which is important, we find that teachers at preschool and at higher levels tend, even against their own principles, perpetuate some of this by saying, boys line up over there, girls line up over there. Boys, will you move the chairs? Girls, will you give out the pencils? Seems innocuous, but these are choices that are made very often unconsciously and can be changed if one wishes to change them, and certainly the INTO has had discussions along these lines. In terms of materials, it's possible to use counter-stereotype books and materials and have debates and discussions on this topic. Another way to look at it is from the point of view of individuals who might band together in campaigns to try and change things, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment of campaigns that we have, that I'm aware of in other countries. And then as individuals, we can say no. We can say no to buying only blue clothes for our boys and pink clothes for our girls. We can challenge retailers and say to them, what are you doing here? We want more choice. We can change our own interactions with children, whether we be grandparents or parents or aunties or uncles or teachers or whatever. Looking at what some other countries have done in schools, it's possible to add gender role awareness training to teacher training and to school curricula. For example, in Sweden, the national preschool curriculum requires teachers to counteract traditional gender patterns and gender roles. Our own curricula here, the Ashter and other curricula that are used typically don't do this. In the UK, the NUT, National Union of Teachers, conducted a review in 2013 called Stereotypes Stop You Doing Stuff, and they encouraged their members to challenge stereotyping. Some of the campaigns I mentioned briefly earlier in the UK, there are campaigns called Let Toys Be Toys, Let Clothes Be Clothes, and these are typically parent-based organizations who get together to challenge retailers, not just to have aisles which are obviously boy toys and aisles which are girl toys, but to mix them together. Same with clothes. And for example, John Lewis brought out a range of unisex clothing for boys and girls as a result of the campaign, mainly Let Clothes Be Clothes. There's another advocacy, a group called Pink Stinks. You can imagine what they are about. Again, challenging retailers and others not to identify girls always with pink and fluffy things, what is called sometimes the pinkification of girlhood. In Germany, Pink Stinks is very active, as in the UK, and in Australia there's a similar organization called Because Why, and many of these organizations are readily accessible on the web. Another level completely would be through human rights and international treaties, and there's a lot of discussion now of stereotypes in those areas. One very important treaty which Ireland has ratified, which is the Convention, often have to read all of this because Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which actually came out in 1979. It talks about requiring state parties who ratify this convention to take all appropriate measures to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women in an effort to eliminate practices that are based on the idea of the inferiority or the superiority of either of the sexes, or on stereotyped roles for men and women. A UN report called Gender Stereotyping as Human Rights Violation, produced by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, talks about wrongful stereotyping and harmful stereotyping. And it is interesting looking at this issue of stereotyping as something very serious, which can have very marked effects on the behavior and well-being of men and women across the globe. In conclusion, then, or some conclusions, the way in which we think about sex and gender is deeply embedded in our culture, and we learn about it from babyhood. It operates in subtle and not so subtle ways. The goal in challenging stereotypes is not to make the sexes the same. Males and females with highly sex stereotype behavior are found to have lower levels of well-being. And this points us in terms of the dangers of a very marked adherence to sex role stereotypes, because it's associated very often with rigidity, and it can be associated in extreme forms with what we might call toxic masculinity. Masculinity which is associated with aggression, lack of sensitivity to the feelings of oneself and the feelings of others, being strong no matter what. This is associated with higher levels of alcoholism and other mental health problems. Likewise in women, being too strongly sexual stereotyped in terms of being very passive, non-assertive, is also associated with things like lower levels of self-esteem and higher levels of depression. Sadly, we found in growing up in Ireland that at 20, far more young women than men were suffering from elevated levels of depression. And we know that in teenage years, previously very assertive and happy young women often start showing lower levels of self-esteem and confidence as they seem to become more sexual stereotyped in their behavior. So stereotypes manifest in multiple ways and need to be tackled then through multiple forms of intervention, both formal and informal, by institutions and by individuals. Thank you very much.